it's an attempt to be, I guess you could say in an old way, you could say coherent. Not that, I'm in praise of incoherence and uncertainty and the condition of the maybe, but it's more, somehow more meaningful, because you're testing your ideas as you go along in practice. So to say that dOCUMENTA was a state of mind, that was it. I suppose you could say it's a bit new agey to say that, like, you're in the state of mind, which is a state of mind of, for example, experimenting forms of alliance, for example, between advanced knowledges in science and very early knowledges of people who are living today or lived in the past outside of most aspects of modernization and modernity, to then not only make artworks that are about that issue, but to actually experiment that form of life in Kassel during the 100 days. It means that it's a state of mind, because it conditions everything from when you wake up in the morning to when you go to sleep. One part of the state of mind was that alliance between the most advanced knowledges of our time and the most ancient knowledges. But even broader than that is that the state of mind embraced creativity, or tried to consider it from a broader perspective than only the human. So in an act of some sort of, you could call it a kind of almost spiritual perspective on what compassion might mean, and what being together with or thinking together with might mean. So it wasn't coming from a feeling of hubris, of some sort of, I know it all and I know how the plants think and how the dogs think. It was more a state of mind of humbleness, where one understands that the human knowledges are only a very small part of the knowledges that are being constantly shared and exchanged and co-evolved through intra-actions, as the feminist and physicist Karen Barad, who was an important influence on my thinking, has pointed out in her book, Meeting the Universe Halfway. So some people thought, oh, she's into, the way dogs think and multi-species coevolution, because Donna Haraway is a friend and also was on my committee of advisors. But it's much broader than just a question of dogs. It's a question of understanding that we dance together with the elements, and there is no we. We are ourselves made up of billions and trillions of small elements that each have their own intelligence, whether it's a cell or a smaller, even subatomic particle. So even the we doesn't quite exist. It exists as a provisional, fragile equilibrium of coalescence of different things. And how that we, that's very fragile and provisional coalescence of things that has a multiplicity in itself, is constantly in acting together with all the other makers of the world, animate and inanimate. So of course one could say there's a slight rhizomatic Deleuzian background to this, which may be true, but I was never a reader of Deleuze. I read Deleuze after everybody started saying, oh, that's like Deleuze, but I had not read Mille Plateaux until, 20 years after everybody else did. So it doesn't really come from Deleuze at all. It comes more from feminist thinking, which is much older and earlier than Deleuze, and from ethology, things coming from the analysis of animal behaviors, and so much, much older. Gregory Bateson would be a bigger influence on me than any of the recent things. So that would be the state of mind. So of course there are artworks that are made by humans for humans and that concern questions that are primarily of interest to humans, but it's an overall state of mind of the dOCUMENTA, of a kind of humbleness of the human involvement in the whole thing, which is why I put the outside inside and the inside outside, which is why there were the little houses in the park, which are insides put outside in the park, and then Ryan Gander's Wind in the entrance, in the whole ground floor of the Friedrichshain was a kind of invisible, beautiful material, why matter matters, the smallest particles of wind blowing through the ground floor of the Friedrichshain, was very much about this inversion and questioning of the demarcations between what is human-made and what is not human-made. So it's not that I celebrated nature, in some neo-romantic way. It's more that there is no difference between nature and culture, and because culture is also natural, even a painting is made of subatomic particles and that go through certain reactions in space and so on. So that's not exactly an artificial, a human-made thing, a painting. It's only partially a human-made thing, and vice versa. Anything that's in the world is coming from something else. I'm in a period that has been going on since last October, and we're now in August, of trying to figure out what dOCUMENTA 13 actually was, and trying to answer that question. So I'm not completely able to answer it. I remember that at the time I thought, and I maybe think, but I'm not sure if I think it anymore or in the same way, but I remember I was motivated by thinking that human fields of study and knowledge are historically determined, and they don't last forever. There used to be alchemists, and we don't really have that as a field right now. We have chemists, but things come and then things end also. The novel appears in a certain moment in literature, and it didn't exist before, and it might not exist in the future, and so on. So I had this thought I had this thought long ago, actually, that art history is based on a very modern idea of art, which is an idea of autonomy of art, and an idea whereby the artist is researching how perception is articulated into knowledge, transformed into knowledge, through the subject matter itself being the means through which that investigation occurs. So it has a kind of self-referentiality. For example, you would explore color with color, representation with representation, gesture with gesture, and so on. Tautological, let's say. And this idea of a kind of practical philosophy made through using the materials or the thing you're experimenting as a means by which to experiment that thing, which makes it a kind of practical philosophy, because your language is not, for example, verbal words as a philosopher's to explore what is a thing. Like Heidegger writes, what is a thing, and he uses words, but he's talking about the jug as being a holding vessel, and so on and so forth. Artists would explore it by making a jug, right? And this idea of what art is, this definition of art, which was questioned by the early 20th century avant-gardes that wanted to break the distinction between art and reality, but never actually did, starts with Winkelmann and starts with modernity in the 18th century, starts with the same generation that created modern parliamentary democracy and the Enlightenment. And I think they started it because they both were a society of makers, producers, because it's the beginning of industrialization, and at the same time they were a society of thinkers and reflectors and the encyclopedia and so on. And they also needed to have a non-useful activity. So the useful activity is the non-useful activity, hence the idea of the autonomy of art. So this notion of art, which basically continues to our day, I thought was sort of over, and that field, demarcating a field called art, was maybe over, and it didn't make sense. And there was more things in common between certain physicists and certain artists than there were between certain artists and other artists. And so maybe in the future there would be no Tate Modern or no Pompidou in the way that they are now. I don't mean that they wouldn't exist as buildings with collections and exhibitions, but there may well be a time when those collections are reorganized completely. And everybody who lives in a certain historical period always thinks that everything is forever because that's the way we are. But, if you were an ancient Egyptian, you thought that political system was the best and it was going to last forever. And today we think that ours is the best, it's going to last forever. You can't imagine something different. But actually these these modes of living and these political systems or these fields of knowledge, they change all the time. And in the early 20th century, for example, human bodies were separated from bodies of other animals and insects when the zoology museum, split off from the so-called whatever museum of anthropology or of ethnology. That was a big break at the time of the birth, the consolidation of the field of ethnographic studies and anthropology. But at the time, it was revolutionary. Nobody would have thought it was normal or logical to take a human body and take it away from the body of a certain bug or snake, which was the 19th century way of organizing those elements. So I had this thought that probably in 50 years, there wouldn't be collections of contemporary art or museums of contemporary art, because contemporary art was really a movement of the 20th century based on an idea of the 18th century of the autonomy of art, joining an idea of phenomenology of the here and now, which developed mainly after World War II. So after the utter shock of being in front of something occurring, whether it's the Auschwitz or the atom bomb exploding, but the sense of the here and now, of being in front of an event which is outrageous and is somehow stunning and suspends time, a time out of time, to go back to Agamben, kind of chirological time occurrences. That sense is a sense coming out of World War II, and it dominated the idea of art, the particular idea of modern art that characterized the last 50 years of the last century. So I just had a thought that probably we would be reorganizing our museums pretty soon, and you might have things that have to do with quantum physics in the same building with things that have to do with literature or film or what we call art and so on. So that's how it started. It wasn't really about wanting to make what I think I read in your question was multidisciplinary work. I'm not interested in multidisciplinary works. I think they're usually the worst. When you put an artist and a scientist together to come up with something, it's usually bad science or bad art. Usually. It just doesn't work. And we know that we've tried that since the 1960s. They've been trying this actually since the 1950s. So it's an old story, multidisciplinarity, and it doesn't work. One of the problems that were addressed indirectly, because it's not that I think about it normally, is that in the age of the symbolic order, let's say, not the symbolic order in a Lacanian sense, in the age of the virtual, let's say, of the digital and so on, of the numeric, of the numérique, as Badiou would say, the art has become an incredible symbol of some sort of knowledge or stability or power. And so there's been an increase in the market and in a certain number of people that have entered into the world of art that didn't find it glamorous before, as an investment or as a question of status, to have status. And that really changed the art world a lot over the last 30 years with the rise of the art fairs and the auction houses and the monetarization, financialization. So not only was the world of the economical world in the post-industrial age financialized with the rise of the stock exchanges and, for example, the quoting on the stock exchange of things that were not quoted before, such as food. That happens in a very particular moment where food corporations start to become investment areas. And when that happens, there's a financialization of food. And that's a disaster, because then during the financial crisis, even though there was an overabundance of production of wheat in the world, there was famine. I don't know if you remember. There was famine because food was in the stock exchange. They couldn't let the price of food collapse or decrease too much, and therefore people starved in the world in that year. So that year we had starvation and we had food being thrown away. So there was a disruption and a financialization and corporatization of the food stocks. Similarly, there has been a financialization and corporatization of art, and which is causing dangerous consequences to something which is a fundamental fundamental ability or need of humans, which is the fundamental need to understand the world and to enter into dialogue with the other makers of the world, culture, poetry, art, that not only humans do, flowers do them, peacocks do them, beavers make beaver dams and so on, but that fundamental activity of all live sentient entities in the world, because I extend art to all of them, became under a kind of threat of extinction, even, I would say, and for a number of reasons. And so one of the things that I think dOCUMENTA did was it ignored it. Because people are feeling a disembodiment in the virtual, they need to hang on to things. So the concrete objects of art, whether it's a video considered as a concrete object once you project it in a room, or sculptures or paintings or installations or performances, those concrete embodied objects take on such importance and aura, contrary to the Benjamin idea of the collapse of aura at the time of the technological repetition of things with photography and so on in the 1920s, in 30s when Benjamin was writing. We're in this opposite period where, because of the disembodied nature and the financialization or numérotisation, the French would say, which means both numbering, transforming into numbers, and also transforming into bits, bits like computer bits. Because of that, there's a need for embodied objects and things. However, they must be of the symbolic order, because we live in the age of the symbolic order of the representation. And so there's this contradiction that is actually embodied in the so-called artwork. And so the artwork became, in cognitive capitalism, to use another word to describe our times, where the political power is in the hands of the cognitive laborers, and the artists are the advanced a wing of the cognitive laborers, the same way that a worker in a factory in the 19th century, in a cotton factory or something, using coal, they were the advanced, they could stop, or they could make or break wealth through either agreeing to work or stopping work, and as the ludists did. And so the people who it doesn't mean that there weren't farmers in the 19th century, but they didn't hold the political agency. So the people who hold the political agency of our times are the cognitive laborers. That's why they're chasing after, Snowden and after the guy, Julian Assange, and so on. These are examples of cognitive laborers who have chosen to act against the system. And the other cognitive laborers who don't are the ones who are making the best and quickest possible software for surveillance systems, or for Google, or for whatever, or for the entertainment industry, and so on. So art fell into this trap, being the product of some sort of elite of cognitive laborers. And I think the dOCUMENTA it kind of touched on this very briefly, very lightly, but it did a little bit. And I felt that I needed to understand this more and better. And so I moved away from doing exhibitions, and I'm now involved in research projects in various universities.